All right. I got the little recording in progress. Okay. Welcome. Ron, it's really good to see you. I'm glad we have a chance to see Galloway behind you.
Thank you.
With you. That's really kind of neat. And I've got the bridge behind me. Ed, we're going to have to get you some kind of an interesting background. So today we're going to be talking about a course that I've developed over the past 30 years called Good-Hearted Leadership. And the purpose is to kind of help people stop firefighting and start moving into preventing them. And the definition of good-hearted leadership is getting impossible things done by engaging followers in a noble purpose that's bigger than the differences between them. And obviously, in whether we're working in a business or culture or whatever, you know, having that unity is really important. So if you go to the next slide, Ed. So what I've done is that I've divided this course into two specific areas. One is obviously leadership, which is how you inspire people. And the second part is management, how you transact things to get things done right. So in the leadership portion, we have 5 elements. And basically, one is you have to have relationships that are strong and collaborative. And we always start by using a tool that I've become accustomed to and I like, simply because it's an easy way to let people know about both their strengths and their weaknesses, called the DISC, and enables us to be able to look at the organization, see where we are strong, where we're weak, so people better understand what it takes to work together. And the second thing is purpose. You know, if you don't have a purpose, if you don't have some way of being able to really ignite the talents and passion of the people that you work with, then you're in a real world of hurt, in my experience. So, you know, we talked significantly about that, and I've given a couple of examples to show how that has impacted other people. And one of my initial examples comes from Nobel, who obviously we now know because he started the Nobel Peace Prize. But what most of us do not know is the reason he did that. At the age of about 47, his brother died of some disease anyway. But when the obituary came out, it was for him and not for his brother. And what it said is that here's the man who invented dynamite, the most effective way of killing people. And of course, the irony of that wasn't exactly what he had defined as the purpose for his life. And he immediately began to think about, what can I do to kind of transform my future and my legacy to make it more meaningful? And from that, he started the Nobel Peace Prize and all the other prizes that go with it. So it enabled him to change. Third is attitude. We all know that a positive attitude and sharing meaning together creates harmony and creates unity that's very difficult to place. Then you have to have values that unite us, that are guiding posts for the company and make it meaningful. And then finally, in terms of leadership, you need to have goals that connect relationships, purpose, attitude, and values together and meaningfully pull people into one another. So that's the leadership side. That inspires people. And then, you know, in order to be able to really help them grow, you've got to be able to manage that. And management is all about transactions. So, you know, you need to delegate who's going to do what. And that's why the relationships are so important in the DISC, because I can tell who's better at certain skills than others, either by asking them or looking at the chart or whatever. So it helps us to be able to know who's got the talents and the skills to be able to do the stuff that I can't do or you can't do personally. Second thing is planning. You know, how do we effectively take all the stuff we learned in inspiration and leadership and now lay out a plan that can be done on a weekly, monthly, quarterly, and annual basis to be updated and make it more effective. Then you have to define your priorities. And, you know, what we've known from looking at Fortune 500 companies is that basically very few of them have more than 3 and no more than 5 priorities in any given year. And so, excuse me, it helps us understand that if we're going to be effective in our life, we have to really clearly define priorities that enable us to take our skills, the skills of our people, and use them forward that way. And then analyzing our time. You know, so few of us really know where our time goes. And if we are more effective about it, we can spend 30 minutes a day and really transform our lives by being able to be focused on what we need to do. And then discipline. And that's about how do you schedule things and how do you organize your life to be able to make the maximum use of your skills and passions of both yourself and your people. So before I go on, any questions?
I just have a comment, and that is that self-discipline is what drives all of these things. A lot
Yeah,
of
that could be, yes.
a lot of organizations are sort of disciplined by hierarchy, bigger ones, but small organizations, small businesses are primarily organized based on the discipline of the owner.
That's a good point. And so if I understood what you're saying correctly, the size, it's like Thoreau once said, every institution is a lengthening of one man's shadow. And what I think you're saying there, Ron, is that if you have a disciplined, effective leader, the organization can grow. If you don't, it's kind of stymied.
Yeah, exactly.
So Ed, do you have any other thoughts, or do we want to move to the next slide?
Well, let's move to the next slide. I found it refreshing to hear Ray's presentation on leadership and management, because we've talked about a lot of different business operations and opportunities where we expect management to be following good leadership and good management practices, but we never really took the time to really talk about why these things are important for building value and reducing risk. So we're looking at this opportunity, we're looking at this thing right now, and relationships are really important. Inside and outside the company, we often talk about inside the company, but sometimes we don't really give enough feedback on opportunities outside the company with win-win opportunities. Really important to make sure everybody's on the same page and building value and reducing risk. So the next part is planning, and I don't really know how you can get anything done without planning. And companies that don't do planning, they just are taking business as usual, and they just keep doing it over and over and over again. But where's the roadmap for making the operation with more value and less risk? What actionable items are being taken to really improve the business? And once you have a plan and a roadmap, then you can focus on accountability to make sure that everybody's doing their part and moving the company forward. So planning is extremely important. We always talked about the value of a strategic plan, and I'm not sure very many companies out there have one, but I think it's a great opportunity for them if they are willing to invest the time and effort to start one so that they can develop their roadmap for adding value and reducing risk. Priorities are always the issue. After you do your strategic planning, you're going to come up with a lot of different action plans that could further improve the value of the company. But you can't do them all at once. That's the problem. You want to try to do everything at once, but you probably won't be successful in doing anything if you take that approach. So you have to prioritize, and I think the best way of prioritizing for the most part is you got to meet compliance issues, number one, but after that, you have to pick the ones that add the greatest value to the enterprise and probably do the best job of servicing the customer. So priorities are extremely important. Analysis, I think it's all many times gets left behind. I think you have to review your financial statements, your balance sheet, your income statement. You got to take a inventory on how you're doing in solving the requests from your customers. Are you meeting their expectation? Are you adding new customers? Are you building revenue? Are you reducing your operating expenses and increasing your margins? Analysis is extremely important. But when you get, again, so involved in the day-to-day operation, it is very difficult to find time for analysis. And to have a separate analysis department, all you're doing is adding expense, which you probably don't want to do. So you want to make analysis as part of everybody's responsibility, so that you're looking at all these opportunities from different viewpoints. And then, as Ron indicated, self-discipline, it's really critical. It is you need continuous improvement in every position. You can't retire in your position. You got to get better and better and better to meet the expectations of the future. And the one thing that really, really is important is the relentless execution of whatever action plans you come up with. It's got to be a part of your value of your company, so that you're moving forward and taking advantage of the opportunities. I always say that rewarding management for doing business as usual most of the time doesn't make a lot of sense. There's probably a way you could find to operate without them. Managers, to be effective, have to come up with ways of adding value to the operation and improving the customer experience. So from my perspective, I found Ray's comments to be extremely relevant to what we've been talking about over the last year.
I might add on the self-discipline issue that the act of planning and setting priorities and goals, of course, is really part of how an entrepreneur who has the ability to do what he or she wants when he or she wants really joins with the company and says, we're going to set these goals and priorities. And really, it's a way to keep the business owner on track, because so many individual business owners just allow their personal goals to change and mold planning, which throws off the team. Sometimes certain ones will allow personal issues to come up in their life and let it affect their business. That throws the team off, and they lose respect for the leader, for the leadership. And so the self-discipline is really key, because you'll lose your team on one hand, but I think that doing this with the potential of outside people looking on is a way to keep the discipline, because it's so hard. I mean, there are some people who are absolutely driven to make more money, to increase sales, to get new machinery, to do a better job. That's hard to sustain for 15 or 20 years. There are not very many individual people who do that their whole lifetime in business. But engaging the whole team is a pact between all of you. And therefore, the owner will perform a little bit better in his or her job in trying to make sure that the team keeps him accountable. And you have to not be afraid to put yourself out there and make those commitments. If you are afraid, then you haven't quite achieved, Ray's ideal of good-hearted leadership.
Well, that's a good point. Ron, with your vast experience in customers, can you give us kind of a rundown looking at these 5 elements and how you would see them impacting, not only gaining customers, but retention of customers?
Sure, yeah. Well, of course, the highest and best use of relationships is to have relationships with customers. Now, that's hard if you sell 10-cent widgets or bubble gum or something like that. But when there's some sort of a relationship that a customer has with the company, you'll find that the customer turnover goes down. And so maintaining that long-term relationship is really key. Many companies try to do something with that, with loyalty programs, frequent flight programs, in order to try and tie people in and develop a symbiotic relationship. And that's sort of the highest and best use of relationships, is when you can create a terrific relationship between a customer and a company. And of course, planning is really the way you get all of these things done. You know, as many people have said before, you know, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there.
Yeah.
And so that's certainly true. So if you don't have goals and you don't know where you're going to go, it's pretty difficult to figure out how to get there. Now, a lot of companies just flounder because they kind of expect business to increase automatically. And most of the time it isn't automatic. Certain industries, certain markets, you have automatic growth. But in order to be able to say you're successful, you have to grow faster than your competitors. And that's the indication that you've done a better job. So planning is a big part of that. And of course, we know that priorities, you know, and Peter Drucker has said there are only two things that businesses do. One, get a customer. Two, innovate. So you go, well, okay, so how are we going to get a customer? You could argue that getting a customer is more important than planning. On the other hand, you kind of have to plan in order to be able to get more than, say, one customer.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
It goes,
it's chicken and egg.
yeah. So it's sort of symbiotic there. And of course, setting priorities is really key. A lot of people will set priorities, you know, and then you sit around a table and sort of like, okay, well, first thing we have to do is we have to buy this machine. We've all kind of been in those discussions. But on the other hand, you might really ask the question a little bit differently, and that is, well, isn't our first priority to create more value for the customer? How does the machine create value for the customer?
Right.
And so the priorities tend to get rearranged a little bit when you realize that if you don't have paying customers, you don't have anything.
Yeah.
And then, of course, analysis is something that can be tough. Not everybody has the gift of good analytical capability, and I don't mean, you know, they're not logical, but taking large databases of, say, customers and customers' purchases and their actions and their opinions, and properly putting them in perspective so that you can identify what is most important to do for customers is something that really does need to be understood. And there are people out there that can do some of those things for you. And you may find that just starting and using a spreadsheet perhaps to take a look at revenues in the top 10 customers, the top 20 customers, whether or not they're growing or not, and how much their margins are. By having good, solid financial statements, you can get started on that analysis. It's really important to consider that the larger you grow, the more information that you need to have about your customers. I heard some an interesting gentleman happened to be on YouTube just the other day, and his contention is that wealth is created by knowledge. It is the direct translation of knowledge that actually creates value, and then you can become wealthy that way. And we're not talking about wealth for wealth's sake. We're talking about growing wealth for the business's sake so that the business can do a better job of creating and satisfying customers. So analysis is a form of knowledge, and therefore don't think of it as a drudgery. Think of it as, how are we going to get knowledge which turns into wealth? Yeah. I think that's a key issue there. And of course, self-discipline I've discussed, and the more self-discipline you have to do all of the other four things above, the better off everybody will be, especially your customers.
It's funny, you were mentioning the idea of wealth creation, and I remember hearing one time that, if we're only for information, we'd all be thin and rich.
Yeah,
Being able to convert all into wealth is a real skill that not all of us possess. And I liked your idea too of, if you become effective about building a team, including, a team of customers who become your advocates, then you can find people who can help you analyze information to make sure that you continue to grow that particular side of the business. So, or any side of the business for that matter, because
true.
we've all seen, having worked with companies, the best CEOs I've worked with understand their weaknesses more than they understand their strengths. And as a consequence of that, they're able to go out and find people and attract them and keep them to be able to identify those areas where they don't have skills. So together they build a team. So.
Mm-hmm.
What I think we're doing here in this analysis is building a culture.
Yeah.
And a culture isn't built overnight. It takes years to build a good culture. And each one of these components is extremely important in developing that culture, so that when your managers are on the floor doing their jobs, they're following the culture, which is increasing the value of the company and doing the best job possible of serving the customer.
Right. So go to the next slide, and then we'll kind of, and I'd like your input on kind of wrapping this up. But this has been my experience with Good Heart Leadership, is that, if you have these 10 elements and you're effectively mastering them and building a team that can, and a culture that can implement them, you will go from firefighting to fire prevention, and that's, the real key of what we want to do as we're moving forward, because as we've all experienced, we've seen CEOs that are chasing their tails, and basically they're more of a detriment to their business than they are a help. Secondly, you do get impossible things done, because people who believe and are passionate and engaging their talents will get things done that you never thought were possible. And as Ron pointed out, develop self-control to solve chronic problems. The thing is, every organization has a chronic problem that kind of plagues the organization, and good leadership is able to ferret that out and find the correct resources to eliminate it, so that we can focus our energy on positive things. The managing of transactions, and it's hard. People say, well, you can't do it perfectly, but the truth is, when we look at good companies with good quality, they will engage and do processes at 99 to 100% perfection. And in fact, they have to. You are competing against other companies who are already doing these things, and unless you're able to, you're going to be a has-been. As Ron has pointed out over and over again, you're either in the top 3 or you're not in it at all, and so you have to be very effective at that. And so the point is that if you can move from a well-intentioned leader to a good-hearted leader, you can grow a business and increase wealth dramatically. So I'd appreciate any feedback from you guys on this.
I love them. I think it hits it right on the head. This is what can happen. And number one's particularly interesting. Instead of fighting fires, which a lot of management teams do, you're into fire prevention and building value. And fighting fires really doesn't, in my opinion, doesn't have a long-term positive impact on the company.
I'd be interested to hear your input, both of you, on where does the firefighting come from your experience? Because I've been in organizations which we actually have arsonists. And sometimes it comes directly from the top. I mean, in other words, people create problems simply because they can. Have you guys had any experiences in small companies where this is an issue? We know it, but sometimes the people who are actually creating the problem don't?
Yeah, I've actually done work with business people that have the philosophy that the way you get stuff done is to go out on the floor and shake everybody up and, kind of push back on them and tell them they got to do a better job, and just literally mix things up.
Yeah.
And in fact, if you're gonna be 99% effective with every customer every time, shaking things up is not exactly what you want to do. You what you want to do is you want to stabilize so that everything becomes uh, very much the same. And of course, you're going to have situations where you have to do something a little bit different to satisfy a certain customer. And different industries have different circumstances. But think about Amazon's incredible success. Do you think that they got that success by fighting fires? They got the success by making sure there never was a fire.
Right.
That every single package was delivered exactly the way it should be every single time.
Right.
And they probably have a 99.9% effective rate in that regard. So the idea of shaking things up just to motivate people is probably not a very good strategy.
Well, I think, one of the things that Ed has said over and over again, people misunderstand the idea of, quote, continuous improvement. But as you pointed out, Ron, once you have a culture in which, people are focusing on effective, successful implementation, they start looking for ways in which they can improve things, and they find things that otherwise you wouldn't even notice. They suddenly realize, have we thought about doing it this way? And the fun part to me is that that's when you get frontline workers who, instead of coming to the job, punching in and turning off their brain and then turning it back on when they leave, actually become involved with helping the process, because it becomes a mental challenge for them as well as a physical to-do thing.
I think sometimes when you come into work and your boss says, we didn't meet this expectation, we didn't meet this, and so then it changes your whole day to fighting fires rather than trying to solve problems in the long term. It happens all the time, and that immediate pressure from whoever it could be really changes your ability to focus on doing your job. So you focus on little problems rather than focusing on ways to really make major improvements. I think a lot of people have problems with that. A lot of companies do, and you have to change that mentality. It's like we're focusing on the wrong stuff. Sure, you're not meeting, you got a problem, you got one complaint, but that one complaint can't be exaggerated where you get off of your game plan, your roadmap on what needs to be done to make the company more effective.
Well, I think right. It's really if you're fighting fires, it's a symptom that you haven't planned well enough.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, to kind of piggyback on what both of you have said, though, one of the things that an employee really expects or performs most effectively on when he feels psychologically safe. In other words, if he can do something and make a mistake and people say, hey, that's the way it goes, I'm glad you tried something new, let's see if we can do to improve it. I can remember talking to the CEO one time. I said, what's it going to take to improve your success rate here? A very successful company already. He says, we've got to improve our failure rate. And it kind of blew me away, because his point was, you don't get better unless you fail and you figure out what you're doing and you manage that process as opposed to beating it up.
I think that's a really good point. I think people do their best job when they're in control of what they're doing and they take logical steps on moving forward. When they're pressured, some people feel that if they pressure someone to the nth degree, the problem is going to go away. And what ends up happening, people freeze. And you take away all their ingenuity, you take away their drive for staying at your company to make things better. They just want to go away. They want to hide. And then when you have a bunch of people who want to hide, who's really taking the reins of the company and moving it forward?
Yeah. What I was thinking, guys, I don't know how you feel about this, but maybe for the next 10 weeks, we can go dive more deeply into each one of these. Ron, you had a good point about analysis. What would you analyze? we could talk about what priorities need to be done. So if you're open to that, it gives us kind of an avenue to move forward and draw on our own experience where we've seen people who've either had purpose or not, or, didn't do an effective job of building relationships. So if you're open to that, I think that might be a good way to move forward.
Sure.
This was a very good presentation, Ray, and it really brings up the basics of leadership and management. And these basics are what's important for developing a culture of a company, for moving a company forward. So I think it's really important to refresh yourself on these various attributes and make sure you're making improvements so that you can fine tune your culture of your company.
Right. I remember I'm a fan of the Green Bay Packers, and Vince Lombardi was notorious for every season bringing out a football and saying, "This is a football." He's starting right back from fundamentals. So I guess what we're talking about is that I think as we all grow, we kind of get away from fundamentals, and we have to go get back to them to make sure that as we help our clients and help each other, we're making sure we're executing the simple little things effectively.